So I could see the progression of speakers in this series. I think there's, as you've already been hearing, lots of exciting advances in potential data streams. There's been talk that we can do cities so much better now, smart cities. It could also be potentially more democratic because we're going directly to the citizen. So there's been a kind of almost a euphoria about the potential. And the potential is real, it's exciting what the possibilities are. I don't usually read, but I just want to make sure, this is my first time putting this particular talk together, so I wanted to read a summary point. So planners and city officials have been harnessing the exciting potential of technological advances such as big data and machine learning to expedite and expand what we can know and do in urban planning. However, when institutions rely on computer algorithms for their work, they can also extrapolate unintended bias and mistaken assumptions into municipal operations, resulting in things like racially biased criminal sentencing, information search, and financial access, as people have been writing about. Algorithmic justice in urban planning has received less popular attention, but the stakes are high. Developing the promise of smart cities requires not only innovative technological skills, but a critical approach that actively seeks to identify oversights and limitations. Without a critical approach to the technology-society nexus, we risk entrenching unequal social structures in even more impenetrable bureaucracies. So that kind of is a major theme. So a lot of the cities, when we are analyzing the city, we often assume what the city is. And this is a visualization. I was a jury member from a master plan competition for Ho Chi Minh City, and international firms are presenting their ideas of the future. And this is so common, the way we imagine the city and what we would like it to be. It's leafy, it's green, and if there are people, we're imagining this kind of scene. And it's assuming certain kind of social class. Usually it's people in ones and twos shopping. And so we provide street furniture for them to rest between shops and enjoy the outdoors. So this is what downtown Ho Chi Minh City is supposed to look like. I lived there. I was part of this competition. This is a scene from actual Ho Chi Minh City. So it's much more densely populated. Oh, I should have said back there we design things like this bench, but you could see here no one is sitting on that bench over there. You know, so there's this. I keep seeing this disconnect from how we manage and conceive and plan for the future city with what's the state on the ground, literally. And we have these conventions of imagining the city. So architectural conventions are often in this aerial view. Some people call it the godlike view that you never see, except maybe on an airplane. It's always green, it's always by the river, and it privileges architecture because that's a lot of what the function of the master plan is setting guidelines for. But when you start thinking critically, it's really odd the way we manage the city. This is a picture of Ho Chi Minh City that at that time had about 13 million people, and there's no people in these images. We're thinking of a city not of people, but of investment and development. And when we do have people, it's sort of this truncated notion. These are some transportation engineering guidelines, and where the prominent objective is unimpeded flow to keep the efficiency and the productivity of the city going. And people are these generic body masses with velocity, and they're all the same, right? And so we can have these kinds of standards about what space bubbles they need. But embedded in all this code is assumptions about who this person is, what they want to do in the city. You can see there's, again, shopping, normal walking, pleasure walking, right? And so these things get embedded into our regulations and codes about what the basic facts should be. But what's happening in cities around the world is that we're at this historic moment of rapid urbanization. And there's all these other kinds of phenomenon going on the ground. So here we have, for example, the public space of a bank building in Hong Kong. And this is what it looks like on the weekdays. And they got a density bonus for providing this. They get to build more real estate on the top floors. But this is what it looks like on Sundays, when the whole fleet of essentially Filipina domestic workers get their day off, and you can see them for the first time, and they're filling the public spaces. And this caused a lot of controversy. This is not the way we're supposed to be living in the city. This is the world-class financial downtown district. But it's also intensely contested. There's been a lot of crackdowns on vendors. This is from Ho Chi Minh City, about what our public spaces should be like, and to try to be this world-class city. And there have been large riots. This is from Xintang, China, a street vendor riot. You could think about the Arab Spring sparked by a street vendor protest as well. So there are these global conditions that are happening on the ground of who's in the city and what's going on. Again, I see this disconnect with what we're doing about management. And you can't escape the politics of what's going on. That this rapid urbanization, for the first time, as you've heard many times, for the first time in human history, most of us are living in cities. And that has primarily come from migration. People have moved, either countries or from the rural countrysides into the city. And so these are often undocumented people living informally, having informal occupations. And so the essential historic moment we're in is one where our very rights to space are being contested. There's a social reconstruction project going on right now about who's entitled to space and under what conditions, what do they owe to society. We're contesting the property regimes we've had. So I lay that as a context for this, the way we're trying to make data about what's happening in the city, and this disconnect I'm seeing between what we imagine are the issues of urban management and this historic moment we're in. And you know, we had this discussion. I think there's a lot of exciting potentials with these new data streams, and I want to explore those possibilities more, but also take a moment that it's not, it harkens back to another era for me. So in the 1950s, post-war period, we had a lot of euphoria about our abilities with science, with engineering, and especially economics, that we could solve so many of our social ills. And at that time, instead of big data, it was big construction, but we can engineer our way out of social problems. And so there's a lot of work done, and the whole field of international development started with that premise that we can solve poverty. But since then, we've had to reconsider that whole approach. And this demolishing of public housing is emblematic of that. That what happened after these big top-down programs was a groundswell of grassroots resistance to things being done to them, problems being solved for them, apparently from the abstract. And that what evolved for us is that we need community participation. We need more representation in these plans, that it's not a physical objective science that's the issue, that there's blinders in a lot of these assumptions about what is the problem and how to solve it. And I'm seeing the strains of this starting to come up now with our big data landscape. That these data streams, they should be objective facts, but they're not actually objective facts. So this is Joy Buolamwini from MIT Media Lab, who showed that the search engines facial recognition software isn't recognizing her darker skinned face. Right? When she put the white mask, then it could recognize her. Right? And you do search engines, and who comes up when you search for different kinds of people. And people have been writing about what's embedded in the code, and who are the programmers and what are they assuming, right? So I think there's also an analogy for this call for urban science, data science, smart cities, in that there's a danger of misrepresenting and further marginalizing. And then to talk about what would be the strategies around that, to not actually create more blindness with more data. Right? So first I'm showing some examples of how it's not a straightforward, there's the data and so we could just analyze it. One thing is, what kind of questions are we asking? What are the metrics that we're interested in that's even framing what the situation is? So one example, we mapped in Los Angeles the digital divide. So who has broadband access at their home? And essentially, the brighter the color, it means they have less, a greater percentage of households who do not have high-speed internet, right? And we coded the color by some racial categories. So not surprisingly, if you know Los Angeles, South Los Angeles has, it's a lower income area, has less household internet connection, and it's disproportionately African American and Latino who's not connected to the internet, almost 50% of the households, right? So when we're thinking about these digital data streams, who's entering into that foray could be uneven. Right? But this is also just saying, even with our census data, and we got the FCC data to see what the connections were, you can have the same data streams we already do, the public data streams, but are we asking the questions that we need to ask? So that's one issue. Another is we can also, so we could work with existing public data. I'm working in the US for the first time intellectually. I've been mostly overseas, so I've been bowled over by the census. But it's which metrics are you using, right? Are we going to stick with the racial categories? Are we going to go down to ethnicities? What is the aerial unit? These kinds of questions. But if there's some things that the census doesn't ask. And so sometimes you need to create your own data. And how do you do that? So my second book collected original data. And essentially, we were mapping what happens on the sidewalks of Ho Chi Minh City. And so it was intense field work with my team. We mapped it physically of how much take of space, as well as what was going on by talking to people. So it's space use, what the terms of it were. And this is what I call spatial ethnography, that we needed both. We couldn't just objectively observe what's going on, because we don't know why they're there and who's not there and under what conditions they can be there, right? So, so this is, for example, the downtown Ho Chi Minh City area in red was just how intensely the sidewalks are used. And this is inspired by May Po Kwan, who's inspired a lot of these things. Thinking about space-time, her influential map of following people's travel paths during the day, but again, asking, is it different by gender? Yes, and having insights like that. What I did was, instead of following a person around, I followed a space through time and see how it's being used differently over the course of the day. So here is one block. And my poor assistants went back and forth every hour from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. recording what's going on. And so going up the Z-plane is time of space use. And each ribbon color shows what kind of use it is. And so one of the things we found from mapping space-time was, first, it's very mixed use. A lot of different uses right next to each other. But what's so fascinating, here we have a call out of one little spot on the sidewalk and some visualizations of photographic images of the kinds of space uses. what was fascinating in this little spot is that the use would change over the course of the day. People were taking turns in sharing the public space. And that really gave us insight on the flexibility of the possibilities of space as not being constrained by square meter area, but it's really our social institutions about who gets to use space at what time, right? I don't know if I could. And part of the challenge is to map differently. So one of my quests always is to break out of Euclidean mapping, which is the colonial tradition, to turn down the sound. Well, they'll finish playing in a little bit. Okay, you get the idea, but map experiments about space-time, maybe not in the top-down boundary border way, but these space-time flows. And so this is what I call cinematic mapping, that we need to decolonize the map and think about, instead of exclusive control 24/7, how these spaces can be renegotiated. So that shows a video of the alley I lived on, and you would walk it many times a day over the course of a year, and the negotiations that happened between the local police on the street, the neighbors, and the vendor about sharing that space. And then I kept going back, and so how that was renegotiated over a 10-year period. And just again to show the flexibility of space, and what this video shows is the periods of clearance where everything was wiped out, and then it would come again, and it was wiped out. One of our map experiments. Another way is part of what this series is about, is that there are these now other data streams, non-public, but they already exist out there, that could be exploited, either from social media, the internet, sensors, and but again, its criticality is key. So this is, I did a number of studies in Asia real estate markets, and I did a sabbatical year in Beijing at Peking University, and was amazed to find this whole market for underground housing, where people are living in bomb shelters and basements. And what was amazing too is that there's internet ads for all these units, and they have addresses, and they have square footage, and qualities of the living situation. So there's the data. And so we scrape the data, we map the data. And so this is an example in Beijing of this subterranean urbanism, I call it. So Beijing is a very large city with roughly 23 million people in the greater metropolitan region, with these ring roads. This is the Forbidden City, and then these ring roads. It's a very monocentric city. And we were amazed to find that there's roughly 1 million people living underground. And we could map this and find, by mapping, that it's generally distributed, right? And so, again, as Shaolin was pointing out, what I love to map are things that are ubiquitous, but we've been blind to, and to make them more apparent. And I keep doing this, and I'm realizing it's always the immigrant migrant class, right, who are eking out space in the city. And I just show some more images because people can't understand what I'm talking about. Urban China has this amazing build-out construction, but what a lot of people don't know, in some cities like Beijing, by code, every building has to build underground spaces. So there's this whole underground layer to the new construction. And what happened was they were subdivided into other uses, including housing or sometimes small retail. And this was actually encouraged by the government because of the shortage of housing, until about 6 years ago. They said no more and evict. And so what this means is, though, the spaces are still there. So in this one I visited, there's a little entrance to the bomb shelter here in the playground. And then there's also entrances from within these two apartment buildings. And if you go down, there's this bottom layer, 2 stories down. And migrants essentially, we found, they spent a year, we did qualitative study, students went and visited the ads. And I thought maybe there's different kinds of people, but almost invariably they are people without the urban residence permit. And they are there to work. And likewise, I was going to do the same kind of study in Shanghai, but actually everyone's been evicted already. But happened upon an even larger market called group rentals, where you are renting a bed in a room full of beds. So within the formal built environment in high rises, whether they be residential or commercial, what we found is I opened this door of a 2-room office building, and inside there are 50 beds, which you can see the shoe rack here. So they're being crammed, bunk beds are being crammed into these units because there's such a huge unmet demand for housing. So it's 1/5 of the population, not that are in this housing, but people without HUCO, the urban residency permit. And so again, but they're living in the city. So there's this large population, and we're not recognizing them or planning for them. And I also like to show, I realize this is actually global. I don't like to make it seem like a Chinese freak show. This difficulty of the kind of working class to find residential space in our global cities is really huge. And so these are some ads we scraped from different cities around the world, including right near USC campus, where you're seeing more and more dormitory type living situations. Okay, so all of those were to show there are data streams, but it's what we do with the data and the kinds of questions we ask that really matter. And I want to show you 3 examples where I think the potential is great. We should develop these possibilities more, but do it with a critical eye, because without attention to this historic moment, and especially to these marginalized populations, we might be further making ourselves blind and not even including them in basic data sets, right? So I'll look at 3 different kinds of data: satellite photos, internet data, and the latest thing I'm doing, which is machine learning of Google Street View images. So one example is satellite imagery. Again, you would think it's just plain facts. It's a photo. We can see who's there. And so people are excited about having this data source of commercial satellites, and that's why I did it, because to get more data, and it's just subjective, that it's circling all the time. So there's a lot of advantages to this source. It's comprehensive. It doesn't care about jurisdictional boundaries. It's of this Earth's surface. And they're continually taking them so you could record change at a more fine-tuned basis than, let's say, a decennial census. Right? Oops. I walked too far. Let me All right. Yeah, thank you. I'll be careful. Okay. And there have been huge advances in how to interpret the satellite images. The images have become incredibly more detailed and multiple layers of light information. So it's exciting. There's always, trade-offs of what you're going to do with it. I won't go into it here. But what was so fascinating to me, so I interpreted satellite imagery, but so did 2 other groups of essentially the same images. And we came out with different results. Okay, so this is Ho Chi Minh City, and this is the downtown. And so we converge on the center. It's unambiguous, the center of the city. We all said this was urban. But where we differ, the 3 groups are a World Bank Commission study from Madison, NYU, Angel Solly's interpretations, and mine. And it's the periphery where we differ, right? And that's where actually much of the urbanization has come to. The rapid urbanization has been from the rural countryside to the periphery. And so what's less clear, this displays how subjective interpreting the satellite imagery can be. We're all three research university groups, right? And so why are they different? And actually, we brought them together for a panel at the World Bank and discussed this. And I went into what they did with the data. And partly it's an issue of who are the researchers and how well do they know the context. So you could see the World Bank had much more area that they covered as counting as urban. And that's because they had done urban sprawl studies in the United States. And their unit of analysis are larger areas of pattern, where there has been, they can have high density pattern, medium density pattern, low density pattern, but that is considered still urban sprawl. And so that's how they're defining urban, right? And so they're covering, in purple are areas that one group said urban and the other two did not, okay? Me and the NYU group had more modest amounts of land coverage that we said were urban. Actually, we're very similar, but where we said urban was also differed. So why mine, in the yellow spots, you can see there's lots of little pointillist detections. So I had the satellite photos, and I lived there for a year as a doctoral student. And so I would trudge out to the periphery and say, this little blurry blip, is it a house? And I go through kind of, newly urbanizing areas, sometimes a little swampy, and say, yep, that's a house. And a lot of these houses were not, they're built with patchwork materials. They could be some dried materials of, natural materials, pieces of corrugated metal, etc. But as I kept going out to the field work and interplaying with the image, I could see with my eye where is informal housing. And then I adapted the algorithm with Pengong and Tsheng Liu based on my ground truthing, right? So that's why I'm privileging all these little houses on the periphery, right? Because it came from my research interest. And the NYU group, they're doing this one city as one of 250 cities doing a global atlas. And they're more interested in just general patterns by continent and typologies of cities. And so essentially the other two groups could not invest time in fieldwork or ground truthing, right? They would do human supervision and correct what the algorithms were doing based on a human eye looking at the picture, but not based on fieldwork. So this shows how much, even with something that seems like an objective data source, such as satellite photos, it's how we interpret what is data from that image, where we can bring in so many assumptions and kind of our institutional biases of how we're understanding the phenomenon, etc. And so this is a picture of some of the conditions that I tromped out and saw, right? Versus assuming urbanization means shiny concrete that reflects light at a much higher brightness level. And this has policy implications. So we compared our identification and where they tend to be located. And there was a higher incidence, not surprisingly, of these informal housing being located near riverways and near roads. And so these are also the areas in low-lying Ho Chi Minh City prone to flooding. So there's going to be implications if we don't see these populations on the periphery. Okay, another example is using the internet data that I showed you I scraped. And again, it's exciting because it's low cost, it's just out there, hopefully within the terms of use, and people have self-reported, it's voluntary, and a lot of times you can geocode the data. But one really interesting thing that happened is, so when we did the Shanghai study, we scraped the internet data like we had for Beijing, but because I believe so much in ground truthing, we went to Shanghai and we answered some of the ads. And what we found was invariably the broker said, come meet me on this street block. And then when we met them, they would take us to a completely different place, different rent, different everything, you know. And then we realized, oh my God, we have fake data. And partly it's because of the political situation. It's an informal market that was being cracked down on by the government. So we quickly regrouped, and the research team we hired, we went out shopping and collected real data for 2 weeks, and were able to compare real data and fake data. And so we paired the location of where the original ad was with what we actually got. Okay. And so, you know, this is what's easy to scrape, and this is what we had to do. Essentially what we found was that, not surprisingly, the actual situation was a little more expensive, a little farther away than advertised, and more crowded than was advertised, right? And partly this might have happened too because there's such a huge demand for this housing. They would go in a day, and given it being a seller's market, it's maybe not worth the time and effort to keep fine-tuning new ads and instead reuse ads. But this gives us pause about what we think we're getting from these data streams without understanding the underlying context of what's going on. Okay, the last project I want to show you is one I'm really excited about. I've been working on it with my team for the last couple of years. And essentially, we are detecting text within a Google Street View image. And we can then use optical character recognition to see what language it is and what the words are and map them. And essentially, these are commercial storefront signs, usually. And what's so interesting about LA is, you know, it's been proposed several times, but always knocked down as unconstitutional, as you can use whatever language you want. And there are many languages on the signage of LA. And also, they mix the languages. There might be 4 languages on one shop's signage. So I found that really exciting. Again, thinking about something I learned from Mei-Po Kwan about we can be reifying unreal realities just by mapping things and seeing, oh, this seems to be co-located. But it does not mean there's actually meaningful social interaction happening, right? So we have to watch for what we're assuming with our spatial data. But I realized here in this instance, this is actual real interaction, that they are speaking in 4 languages to potential customers. And so I think we can have, because Google Street View, kind of like satellite images, are constantly the cars roving around and recording what's going on in real time, and shops open and close often. And can we leverage that information? We can also see what's happening at the street level. You know, my experience of Los Angeles when I drive around is the signage gives me a sense of place. I'll realize, oh, I guess I'm in Little Ethiopia because there's so many Ethiopian signs, right? And so we can see, instead of the official Chinatown, for example, find that there's actually 5 real Chinatowns that are huge cities. And my Chinese students, that's what they're referring to when they say Chinatown. We can also interact this layer with so many other exciting layers like real estate values. And I've been talking with the LA City data office, and something they're concerned about is whether they are unfairly exacting enforcement on businesses because they don't know the ethnicity of businesses. And the business signs could give us a clue on the ethnicity of the business, as well as, you know, who's receiving the economic development programming support. I also was interested because there's been a number of these maps recently of the segregation in the United States. New York Times has done it, Washington Post just did one recently, there's a UVA dot map, there's so many of these, and it's important, you know, in our system, housing is a important form of capitalization, so it really matters But I keep hearing this narrative of residential segregation, right? And I realized what I'm seeing in LA is also another kind of ethnic pattern of commerce, of business, that we don't, we were talking about, this is important, but it's kind of like where we sleep at night. But in LA, we drive around, go around, bus, all over, right? So you work in another place, you might practice your culture, your ethnicity, your belonging place in another. And so having a more dynamic view, network view of the city. And so to kind of balance this narrative, I am mapping ethnic commerce to see what that pattern is. Also, this kind of data stream can fill a gap that we don't have. So we looked at some data stream, public data and private data, and found that the LA City Office of Finance, where these governments, businesses are supposed to register, it's about roughly 30% out of date because businesses often don't inform them when they close. We did Google Map searches and found, again with my students doing fieldwork, that a lot of the smaller mom and pop type shops don't show up. And that was also true for the private business data sources from Dun & Bradstreet and Reference USA. So we could have a more expansive data. So here's an example of some of the signage you might see in LA. So this is 3 languages, Korean, Spanish, and English. Saying, dentist. So we made a little visualization to show you. Right now, we're finishing up the data processing and doing error testing, but I wanted to give you a sense of what this could be like. So we've been working hard on this. I'm excited about it, but I'm also, again, self-critical, thinking about what we're doing here, right? Because all we're doing is taking the text at face value about what's being said, which might be different from what's going on inside. We might not know what the ethnicity of the owner is, which might be different from who they're selling to. We don't know who are the workers, right? Are they selling, is this for them marketing, or is this a form of cultural expression? So we have been interviewing business owners to ask, why do you have this sign? And there's a variety of reasons. So we need more theorizing about what we think these signs actually mean. But but I think it already has opens up for me the idea of ethnic patterns in the city. Another example, also thinking about how complex this is the example of Bill's Taco, which is a restaurant that one of my students found, and we're making these little documentary videos to think critically about signage. Outside it would say Bill's Taco. We would probably code that as Mexican. And originally the store was created by a Mexican American, but it's in a black neighborhood. And right now it's owned by a Korean American woman. But when you go inside Bill's Taco, it's a black culture space. The murals, and then all these famous celebrities come and eat there. And the taco is a special taco. It's a hamburger patty with gravy on it, right? So it's really, you know, we would just be coding it as Mexican, but it's much more complex. And it's an important space. You know, it's talking with the customers. Some people are driving 2 or 3 hours to go to Bill's Taco because it's their place, right? So it's, you know, we need to go deeper with what we're talking about here. So I'm aware of that. That's something I'm working on. So how do we get around this? So with each of those examples, I think there's some clues of how I'm thinking about how to overcome our blind spots. So one is to have a diverse research team, diverse in a number of parameters. You know, life experiences, you come in with different assumptions is one thing, but also interdisciplinary diversity. So I was giving a funny example of my research team, which includes a computational biologist and animation designer. And we're working together on this ethnicity mapping project. And I remember this one meeting where the programmer is writing how to map this in a mathematical formula, and another person is drawing pictures, and we're talking about the same thing. But we had to figure out the problems together, and we had to keep translating between these epistemologies, right? And so what I found is, luckily, you know, I have a really kind of humble group who's really trying to understand each other and work through their problems together. It's also really fun to come up and problem solve, but just realizing how we need to do this translation in what we're saying is important. And you know, I've been in urban planning departments. They're interdisciplinary, but sometimes interdisciplinarity can just mean you're sitting next to each other. And can we really communicate and translate across the disciplines? It's much harder to do. But we really need this in this new smart data science wave, because I've been seeing studies about the city by purely computer scientists. And they're great at studying patterns, but knowing what this means can too easily make leaps in assumptions where it would be helped by the social sciences, could be helped by the humanities, because we've been looking at this for a while, right? Another is ground truthing and fieldwork. I think so many of these mistaken assumptions could be so easily solved by going there and talking to people, right? A lot of them just become really apparent if you're actually there. But also sometimes you maybe need to be guided by you know, local organizations. You might have still your professional blinders in that space. But I think, as I showed in several examples, ground truthing can go a long way. And then, of course, participation, that we're not just studying these people out there, but that they have knowledge at the ground level that can inform us and which we've learned from history. So that's what I would like to contribute to this series, is thinking harder about when we do take advantage of these new data streams, that we keep a critical eye of the blind spots, because it's an uneven data stream. And for us to, there's a lot of exciting potentials from them, because often they have much more fine-grained time stamps. They're not limited to census tract units, but could be at a much more detailed level, so you could change aerial units, etc. There's a lot of potential, but it needs to be informed by different kinds of knowledge. Thank you very much for your time.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. We do have time for questions, comments, remarks. Yeah, go ahead. We have microphone. That's another one.
Annette, this was amazing, fantastic, really. I think we should make it required for all of our students in our department. Beautiful work. One question, you touched on it, you said you saw different gender differences when you were mapping the sidewalk use and something, I think that is where you said you did notice gender differences. Have you looked into that more, like the patterns of sidewalk uses or any of the work you have done actually? Is that something that, I know you might not be able to present it here, but that you could send me to a reference or just briefly mention? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Faranak, for coming. I studied gender in the sidewalk work in Vietnam. I didn't mention it here, but it was something I kept an eye out. There's a literature, for example, Irene Tinker has talked about gender and vending might vary between cultures, about whether women can be in public space, for example. What I found was, in some ways, the sidewalk is quite egalitarian. That's what I loved about living there, was all different classes were mixing in the space. There's men and women, both business owners and customers. There seemed to be a correlation between the type of vending and gender. So almost all the motorcycle taxi drivers were men. Some of the heavier produce were usually done by men. So it seemed to, there are a couple of gender differences. And you're reminding me that I forgot to show, that's my great team of interdisciplinarity. You're doing cultural asset mapping with local communities to get their knowledge and interfacing it with city planning departments. But this is what I want to show you. So yes, we should require this critical approach more. And so we surveyed the planning programs across the U.S. and the syllabi of their essentially GIS type classes. And it's just the syllabi. We didn't interview all the instructors, but only 7% devoted time on their syllabus to issues about ground truthing and critical data. So there's a lot we can improve, because that's what I'm excited about, is the next generation needs to do the translational work, right? And so my kids, this Code for America, it's going to be kind of like a basic language, but what can they do with that language is the key. And we need to train people to watch out for what could be the blind spots and how we can remedy them, right? And then the same way on the reverse end, to encourage more disciplinary participation on the data science side and criticality, which is not there yet, I think. Did you have your hand up? Oh.
No questions?
Thank you so much for your great and amazing presentation. My question is about the paradigm in urban planning. So at one of the slides you mentioned is the end of the top-down planning approach, which can be named as regional planning. But do you think that this, in these days, in the era of speed development of technical things such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, actually some of your projects are mainly involved with those kind of machine learning technology. And do you think those kind of technology advancement that we are looking at, we are approaching at these days, may affect new paradigm in urban planning? My thinking is maybe it will revisit rational planning, because from my understanding of the rational planning is at the time that our society is full of like science can solve anything, But I think those kind of atmosphere can be revisited these days. So what do you think about the future of planning paradigm in these days?
The future of it. Well, that's why I was saying to invest in the next generation. I do, at least the way the discourse has been going, it does seem like rational planning revisited, but that we're calling urban planning a science, that our ability at analysis, technical analysis in solving problems. So that's why I showed the examples of urban renewal, which any planning student knows is taught as a huge failure in our history, and we don't want to do that again. So that's why I like to bring those images. We've seen this before, but it doesn't have to be. So, you know, I think there are potentials with these new abilities, new data streams, but the key backlog always is us, our conceptual framework, you know, what we do with it. And you're right, I see so much just slicker versions of the old models of the same maps, but now they're moving and, you know, designed differently, but we haven't really learned anything significantly new. Or there's beginnings of that maybe we can have, the hope is, you know, breakthroughs, conceptual breakthroughs. So that's what we should work towards. But I think no one person, no one field can do it. That's why I think it's really going to be at that translation. And we have to have people be able to do that work and know where the potentials are and how to communicate, right? So it has to be a collaborative effort. Yes, Ralph?
Annette, thanks so much for your really stimulating talk. It's great to see the images and see the range of imagination that you're bringing to the project. You barely mentioned the words license agreement or use agreement as you were talking about the work that you've been doing. Mm-hmm. And I've been really wondering, it seems like you're using, and this isn't a criticism of you, it's more like thinking about how to go from research into practical applications with some of the ways that you're using these techniques to make inferences about what's happening on the ground. So for example, the images that get harvested from Google Street View, they're not, it's, you know, I don't know if that's okay to do mm-hmm. under the usage terms that Google Street View mm-hmm. Allows. And if they're not, it may be okay for a researcher to use in that way, but for a city government mm-hmm. or for someone else to use it that way, there may be some concerns. So if you could say a little bit about how you personally think about developing methods and insights based on open data and public data versus what more you need to get mm-hmm. from commercially available data, including data that you're getting, let's say, informally, that you're using in a way that may or may not be consistent with what the producers think of as a legitimate use of their data. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, no, I'd love to. So we stay within the terms of service, but those terms of service are changing. So in July, Google restricted how much you could download each day. At a certain point, you need to pay more. And so we're like, oh, so we've been very slowly collecting the images to stay within terms of service. And I've been trying to have a meeting with them because our university has representatives with them. Somehow it still hasn't happened yet, but we're just developing the methodology as we continue. I think that's part of basic ethics is to do it in a way that is agreed to. There's other ethical issues, you know, and this came up with my street vendor. I don't know if Google goes around asking permission to take pictures of everything, right? It's amazing now. Some of them you could go into the buildings and see what's on the shelves, you know. So there's, you know, as we're hearing, a lot of privacy issues to be worked out. I mean, for example, in my street vendor research, I passed IRB because these are open acts out in public space. They're actually commercially trying to interact with people. But we systematically collected what was going on. And you have to think about the vulnerability of the population. luckily, in my case, vending was happening everywhere. You don't need a map to find it. But other places you couldn't. So except, for example, the Beijing Underground or the Shanghai group rental, we make the dots very large, like a whole city block. So you can't use it to locate people. So ethics are really important. About the future, I think we still really need the public data collection. The census is key because that will have complete coverage. I think what we don't know is how uneven the coverage these other sources are. People are trying to get, they won't share the individual demographic data, or sometimes they don't ask. So, but we're already seeing there's different ethnicities overrepresented, underrepresented in Twitter versus Groupon versus Yelp versus, right? So the picture we're getting, if we just look at one of these sources, is going to be uneven. And so we can't proclaim that this is representative or everything that's going on. So I think there needs to be more thought about that. And I think in terms of mashing up, that we have these different incomplete streams, maybe incomplete variables we would want from, let's say, the census, but can we do something by mashing them up together, right, that are interesting, that give us insights that we haven't had yet, at least, right? So that's the way I've been approaching it. Yes, okay, yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your work. It's been super inspiring. I had one question. Earlier when you were talking about residential segregation maps, I remember one of the things that you said was you wanted to build a network view of where people live, where they work, and where they shop, etc.
Yeah.
Having studied Ho Chi Minh City and Los Angeles, do you notice a difference in terms of this network of how, or this map of where people live, where they work, and where they shop based on their ethnicities, or just based on these different cities because of the countries they're in? Los Angeles, I would say, isn't as dynamic as Ho Chi Minh City, which probably changes every other month based on the way people are going. Do you notice a difference based on their ethnicity, or based on how dynamic these cities are, or based on income groups at all?
Okay, thanks for your question. So in terms of this network view, and this connects to the mashup comment, we mapped, for example, we can map the ethnic commerce clusters and then contrast that with residential patterns, right? And we don't know that they're the same people, but you see that, and it's to debunk the older notion of ethnic enclaves, as we just huddle and live and work and have networks with each other, that people have been moving and often maybe optimizing their residential location, but that this kind of cultural place of belonging is another kind of use, right? So mostly we're just contrasting, here's the ethnic residential pattern, here's the ethnic commerce pattern, and that already debunks some of these older ideas of city. But we can't do individual actual trips unless you get clearance like Mayflow does to put GPSs on everyone. So that's, we partly playing these map layers off of each other. You're right, so dynamic already. Within our 2 years, we're seeing a lot of these signage change in Los Angeles. Something I'm starting to suspect is that they're also becoming more assimilated. So what I've been seeing is maybe other script signage converts to an English sign, even though it's the same shop. And that's interesting too. You know, I think there's interesting studies we could do about gentrification, commercial gentrification, not residential. And that's a big concern for communities, is our place is now not our place anymore in terms of a place to be, like placemaking. And so another thing you could exploit with Google Street View images is change over time, which some people have been doing, of residences, but now you can see of commerce. Did it become a taco shop and then a cafe? You know, what are we saying that is, right? Is it changing languages, right? There could be, I feel like this could be just a base layer that could be studied in so many different disciplines. Linguistics, the mashup of languages and cultures. It's combine it with real estate values, or there's just so many possibilities. So I think the mashup is key. Comparing Ho Chi Minh City and LA, I haven't really thought a lot about, except now I'm finally studying a US city, and it's more to me that LA is a global city like the global South cities I've been studying my life, and a lot of the dynamics are really similar. So, but both places are changing really rapidly. So one of the things we're doing with Google Street View is taking the image of the same place from about, with an 8-year time span, to see if there's been a change in that same building. The changes are happening that rapidly, especially commerce. Businesses go in and out sometimes pretty quickly. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, I have the microphone. Can I just say, I'll be quick, brief, yeah. And regarding your question, actually, Yu Ming Park in this department, in the geography department, has done some work on this, and so I think that you can talk to her. And but I want to get back to Annette's wonderful presentation, and it's very inspiring and innovative. I think that the black spot, work is very interesting, and it's shocking to see all these people, living underground, but I'm wondering what is next. For example, what do you want to see after you see the distribution of these people? I mean, I actually think maybe one area, can you visualize conflict and power? That might be something to think about. Of course, it's a big question, and I think that is, maybe you can comment briefly, or we can talk over dinner.
Right. I didn't study the politics I didn't map the politics in Beijing necessarily. There's political implications of what we're seeing here. I'm calling it informality 2.0. Before we thought informal large settlements happen on the edges of the city. But what I'm seeing now with these cases and in LA is, we are enforcing property rights more and more and redeveloping and making world-class cities. But the migrant population is still there. So what I think is happening is they're getting more and more hidden within the formal built environment. There's hidden overcrowding, right? Finding interstitial spaces. And the political ramifications is it could be a lot harder to do collective action about doing infrastructure improvement for their needs when they're so dispersed and hidden, right? Before, maybe if you were massed together, that's the theory of public space, you'd see each other, make yourselves visible. Although then I was having an interesting discussion with one of your colleagues but maybe that's one of the potentials of these technologies. I mean, the Arab Spring, a lot of it was with the social media platforms saying, let's meet here, even though you're dispersed, right? So there could be, there's really interesting critical maps about these power relations. I didn't do it for Beijing, but for Los Angeles, what I showed you is just one of many sub-projects of my larger ethnicity project. So another thing we mapped were groups approaching city council saying, we want you to put an official LA city sign that this is our place. Like the little Ethiopias, the little Bangladesh. And it's so interesting to me because you get nothing but the sign, no extra voting power or money or anything, but groups are fighting for this symbolic space because, no, it's mine, because we're still mapping it as exclusive territories when it's really cognitive, and no one knows where actually the boundaries are because they're hidden in the Bureau of Engineering, and actually the DOT sign guy is the one who just goes and put it up for a long time until they made a process because they started fighting. So I do think as our cities get denser and denser and we're trying to, we have these very different spatial projects of a heterogeneous group, there's going to be more and more conflict, and planning has a big role to play about how we say who has what space under what conditions, right? So I thought it was really interesting about the symbolic space because when, for example, we have a map overlaying different organizations' ideas about where the boundaries of Koreatown are, and everyone has different borders. They kind of agree on the center, but no one really knows, including the police department, the redevelopment authority. So these are not individual Lynchian cognitive maps, but organizations' cognitive maps, right? And so why do we care? Why do we privilege the borders so much, right? It's really a colonial approach. Can we map with centers, right? Do they have to be exclusive? They're not in reality. As you saw, there's a lot of mixing culturally, right? So I think power is definitely all over urban space. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, sorry, we are not able to take any additional questions given time. We're already over 5 p.m. But the final comment made there about mapping of space is intriguing because a lot of times we're thinking of place, which does not necessarily have boundaries, or everybody's perception of boundaries are different. So the placial mapping is another intriguing direction related to your work. I think worth exploring. But having said that, let's give Dr. Kim another round of applause. And we have a little token of appreciation. Most importantly, has a glow on it.
That's great.
Recognizing all your wonderful work.
Thank you so
in
much.
the international sphere.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great.